36 men. In 1284, the English crown put that number in writing. The full garrison for Harlech Castle, one of the most ambitious fortresses England ever built, still rising out of its rock in North Wales at the time. The list survives: a constable, 30 soldiers, a chaplain, an artiller to service the crossbows, a smith, a carpenter, a stonemason. That was enough, because the building itself did the work of an army. Every odd-looking piece of it had a job. One of those pieces was a toilet, and it brought down a castle men called impregnable. We'll get there. Look closely at almost any castle wall, and you'll find rows of small square holes climbing it in neat lines. They aren't damage. They held the wooden scaffolding the original builders stood on, and many were left open on purpose. In wartime, defenders slotted beams back in and hung a timber gallery off the battlements so they could drop stones straight down the face of the wall. The curtain wall itself, the long run of stone between the towers, typically stood 20 to 30 feet high and could be 10 feet thick. The towers tell you a date. Early builders made them square, since square is cheaper, and the rooms inside are actually usable. But a square tower has corners, and a corner is where you attack it. In 1215, King John's miners dug under a corner of the great keep at Rochester, propped their tunnel with timber, and burned the props, feeding the fire with the fat of 40 pigs. The king's written order survives: pigs of the sort least good for eating. The corner came down. When the keep was repaired, that corner came back round. The shape builders were already switching too, because a cylinder gives a miner nothing to bite. You can still see it today. 3 square corners and 1 round one. The gate is the one hole in the shell, so it got more engineering than anywhere else. Some drawbridges worked like a seesaw. The bridge pivoted in the middle, and when the outer half swung up, the inner half dropped into an open pit in the floor of the passage. Raising the bridge turned the doorway into a hole. Behind it hung the portcullis, an oak grid shod with iron, sliding in stone grooves. Big gatehouses carried 2, and the plan for Caernarfon's King's Gate called for 5 doors and 6 portcullises in a single passage. In the ceiling between them sat openings called murder holes. Defenders could drop stones through them onto anyone trapped below, but their likeliest day job was humbler: pouring water down to put out fires set against the wooden gates. The boiling oil from the films is mostly myth. Oil was expensive, slow to heat, and dangerous to carry along a wall. Water was free. Cut into one of the great doors, you'll usually find a much smaller door, barely shoulder-wide, called the wicket. The main gates might stay shut for weeks, while every farmer, messenger, and servant stepped through it one at a time under a porter's eye. Through the gate you're standing in the bailey, the open courtyard, and in peacetime it ran like a farm crossed with a repair shop. Stables, because horses were the most valuable thing a lord owned that could move. A smithy. Harlech's 36 included that salaried smith, carpenter, and mason, a standing maintenance crew for the building itself. A bakehouse with masonry ovens. King John ordered ovens at 2 of his castles big enough to roast a whole ox, and a brewhouse running more or less constantly, because the staple drink was ale, and ale soured in days. A royal ordinance of 1318 entitled every member of the king's household to a gallon of it a day. Beyond the walls sat fish ponds, orchards, rabbit warrens, and a dovecote, since keeping doves was a legal privilege of rank. The fortress was wrapped around a farm. The tall tower in the middle is the keep, and its medieval name explains a modern word. They called it the donjon, the Lord's Tower, from the Latin for lordship. Lords kept prisoners in those tower rooms because nowhere was more secure, and over the centuries donjon became dungeon and slid down into the cellar. The torture pit under every castle is a Victorian invention by and large. Most castles had no purpose-built prison at all, and the word oubliette reached English through a novel, Walter Scott's Ivanhoe in 1819. Plenty of oubliettes shown to tourists today are storerooms, ice pits, or old latrine shafts. The real keep was the strongest and showiest building in the castle, walls up to 21 feet thick at Dover. The only door, a full story above the ground, reached by an outside staircase the defenders controlled. Storage. Below, the Lord's chambers, above. One room was the banquet hall, the courtroom, the tax office, and at night, the dormitory, the great hall. Dinner was the main event, served late morning, often around 10, announced with a horn. Trestle tables went up for the meal and came down after it. The Lord sat on a raised platform at the far end, and everyone else sat in strict order down the room. Between meals, the same tables handled the Lord's business. Rents were paid here. The Lord's court sat here too, and the fines it handed out went into his coffers. At night, much of the household simply lay down and slept where they'd eaten, on benches, on tables, on the floor. Private bedrooms were upstairs, for the family at the top, and nobody lit the corridors on the way to them. You carried your own light, a smoky tallow candle for most people, a rushlight if you were poor, beeswax if you were rich or praying. None of it worked without water, and builders went to absurd lengths to secure it. The well at Beeston Castle drops 370 feet through sandstone, probably the deepest castle well in England. At Kyffhausen in Germany, the shaft runs 577 feet. Dover's Keep had actual plumbing in the 1180s, 2 lead pipes carrying well water through the thickness of the walls to the rooms below. In 1136, the wells at Exeter failed in a summer drought, mid-siege, and the garrison held on using its wine stores. They drank wine, cooked with wine, kneaded bread with wine, threw it on the fires the besiegers started. When the wine ran out, they surrendered. Walls don't fall to thirst. Garrisons do. Waste went out through garderobes, small latrines built into the wall, each with a chute dropping to the moat or a cesspit below. The pits were dug out by cleaners who worked at night, and the trade was as dangerous as it sounds. In 1326, a Londoner known as Richard the Raker fell through the rotten boards of a privy and drowned in the pit underneath. Toilet paper was moss, hay, or straw. The moss still turns up when archaeologists dig out the pits. Now, the toilet. In 1204, French soldiers got into Chateau Gaillard, Richard the Lionheart's supposedly impregnable castle, by climbing in at the latrine outlet beneath the chapel and letting the attackers into the second courtyard. Within days, the castle fell. Builders learned. Later chutes were narrowed, so a man couldn't climb them, walled in at the outlet, or dropped sheer over water. The owner of all this was usually somewhere else. A great lord held dozens of estates and ate his way through them in rotation, moving constantly. And the whole household moved too. Beds built to be dismantled, tapestries rolled into canvas bags. Edward I's household traveled with 6 long carts, 7 short ones, and 41 pack horses. The castle ran on without him. The constable commanded it. Rents and accounts went through the steward. The chaplain handled the chapel, the letters, and the Lord's own seal. In a royal castle, the county's courts met in the hall, and taxes flowed through it all year. The lord might sleep there 3 weeks in a year. The rents came in all 52. All of this was tested rarely, and when it was, the fight looked nothing like the films. In 1266, the rebel garrison of Kenilworth, about 1,200 people, including wives and children, sat behind an artificial lake covering 100 acres. The king brought trebuchets, siege towers, and barges hauled overland from Chester for a night assault. All of it failed. The walls were never breached. The siege ended after 6 months because disease was spreading and the food was nearly gone. At the surrender, about 2 days' supplies remained. That's how castles usually died. Storming one was rare and ruinously expensive. Hunger did the work instead. So the most important weapons in the building were the well and the pantry. Modern historians mostly read castles as homes first, a residence and a tax office dressed to look invincible, so it would rarely have to prove it. It was also a home built by people who assumed somebody would one day try to kill them in it. The machine worked so well, it almost never had to run. 36 men, a chaplain, a smith, and a wall that did the arguing for them. What it cost to raise a wall like that, and who actually built it, is its own story for next time.